everybody. I want to welcome you to the School of Architecture Lecture Series program, and thank you for joining us today from wherever you are. I think we're seeing where people are joining from all over the country, which is fantastic. It's great to have past alum with us, and wherever you are, really welcome and thanks for joining us. I'm Scott Marble. I'm the chair of the School of Architecture. And I'm really pleased today that we have Justin Garrett Moore to give a talk and to kind of take us on a tour of one of his projects in New York City. And we're able to bring Justin here with us today because of the generosity of one of our local firms here in Atlanta, TSW. So this is actually the first TSW Lecture on Urban Design. And we're super excited about this series that they have very generously sponsored. TSW, for those of you who don't know, is a multidisciplinary design firm here in Atlanta with a focus on planning, architecture, and landscape architecture. And I encourage all of our students to definitely get to know their firm and get to know their work. It's really exciting work that they do. So they've recently celebrated their 30th anniversary, and that's kind of what I think triggered this partnership that we've developed with TSW. And this lecture series, which will be a series of lectures over the next several years, was set up to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the firm's development. So I really want to thank TSW and especially Bill Tonnell and Tom Walsh for working very closely with Ellen Dunham-Jones and Susan Sanders, our development officer, to make this very special series possible. So thank you guys very much for that. So Justin Garrett Moore. I'm really especially excited to welcome Justin here as the inaugural TSW lecturer. And I guess I'm also a bit proud since Justin was a student of mine many years ago when he was pursuing his Master of Architecture degree at Columbia University. And I have to say, based on the time I spent with Justin as a student, I'm not surprised at the success that he's had in his career and where he's gotten today. Justin is doing fantastic work. And I'm very proud of him as a past student and really pleased that he's with us. When Justin was doing his MArch, he was also pursuing a Master of Science in Urban Design. And this dual education has clearly had a big influence on his career, the success he's had to date. So just a little hint for those students that are out there, you could consider doing the same thing. I know Ellen would be very happy with that. So, it's something that you might want to consider and maybe talk to Justin about at some point. Today, Justin does many, many things. He wears many hats. His primary job, I think, he does so many jobs, I don't know which one is the primary job, but he's the executive director of the New York City Public Design Commission. And this is an agency in New York City that plays a really critical role in maintaining design excellence for all publicly funded projects in New York. I've personally presented to them many times in the past and can say that it's always an engaging discussion and honestly projects end up being better based on the input and the support really that they provide to the design community in making sure that public projects in the city are built to the highest standards. He's also adjunct faculty member at Columbia University Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, and at Yale's School of Architecture. He's the founder, CEO, and director of Urban Patch, which is an organization that works with communities around the world, really, to improve their environment, working on projects that include housing, open spaces, schools. They've done work in many places, including Rwanda, and I think in addition to the work that Justin's been doing with the City of New York, I think he's going to be discussing some of the work that he's doing with his organization, Urban Patch. He's also a board member of the Black Urbanist Collective Black Space. And needless to say, Justin is also a frequent lecturer around the country and around the world. We were just talking before we got started here that he had a meeting just a few minutes ago with a group in Kosovo, and is doing these online meetings really all over the world, and just advocating for kind of the public realm. After Justin's talk, we will have a Q&A after the lecture, and that'll be moderated by our very own Joel Jassu, who is a recent graduate of both the MARC program and the MSUD program. So in fact, there you go. Joel is following in the footsteps of Justin. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Justin Garrett Moore.
Great. Thank you so much, Scott. And, absolutely, I'm very honored and proud to be here with Georgia Tech. And thank you to TSW for creating this program that allows for the Georgia Tech community to have an elevated and ongoing discussion about urban design. This is a critical conversation, and it's important that we reach new audiences in this work. And definitely also want to give a nod to Scott. He was my professor so many years ago, and I still remember the studio and the conversations that we had there that still impact me to this day. So for those of you that are still students, do kind of pay attention and listen and learn and exchange, because it really does follow you throughout your life and throughout your work. And coincidentally, one of the projects that I'm showing today happens to be the same site that I happened to look at during that studio with Scott all those years ago. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Give me one moment here. And the beginning, I'll sort of give an initial framing of work, which is to talk about urban design in a much bigger picture that is beyond the work that urban designers do directly. And so this is something that I'll return to later in the talk and the presentation, but I wanted to bring it up front. This is from something called the New Frontier Plan by an organization called the Flanner House, which was a social services and community development organization in Indianapolis, Indiana, which is my hometown. And it says, what is it about? About people, about their needs, their abilities, the land they live on, the land they till, the food they grow, about the cities they live in, about the jobs they do, how they do them, about the houses in which they live, about what people know and don't know, and what they ought to know to help make America still greater. And so these questions, like what is it about, and all these questions are important for urban design. And so when we're doing work in places like New York City, these questions come up in many different ways. This is something that we've done as part of the city with the Department of City Planning and various agencies to talk about what are our sort of considerations for urban design, and as we're looking at community change in the built environment. And so other questions, what it might be about. It might be about place, right? What makes place? How do we define place? Who gets to shape place? More importantly, and especially in the moment that we're all going through now, I think the question of equity enters the conversation. So who's benefiting? Who doesn't have access, right? All of these sort of things challenge us to think about our practices and our contexts in new ways. And the current administration in New York City, the Mayor de Blasio administration, I'm one of his appointees, has pushed equity as a conversation even before, the crazy year we're all in 2020, where things like the COVID-19 pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement have really challenged a much larger conversation around equity and justice. And finally, of course, as designers, we're responsible for things like details, not just what, but how, and the role that design and built environment has there, and ultimately a responsibility to comfort. It's also important that we understand that this work needs to happen at different scales, and I definitely plug the prompts to potentially look into sort of expanding your education to include urban design, which does look at other scales of operation. So that may be the scale of a city or even a region, with things like urban policies, zoning and land use, transportation infrastructure that operates at large scales. But also we operate at the scale of neighborhood and building, which is probably more what people are familiar with. But an important baseline for all this work is to understand that we're responsible for the scale of human experience, right? So we're responsible for our environment and our economy and all these different things, but ultimately design does need to interface with human experience. And so my role within the Public Design Commission and within city government is complicated. For any work that happens in an urban context, or really any community context beyond the confines of a private or a contained site, has to interface with a lot of different things. So this scary image is a organization chart for the city of New York. The people are up at the top, and then people like the mayor and the council members and all these people are there managing this large government that has lots of different components: the health department, the transportation department, the fire department. But also there's this little department called the Public Design Commission. And we're the agency that says that design matters, right? We have oversight over the design of everything that's built on the city's public property, which includes things like streets, parks, public buildings, and publicly owned development. But outlined in magenta here are all the different agencies that also have a say over the built environment. And anyone that has done this work knows that the challenge can be that everyone is operating in their silos, making independent decisions, and there can be challenges and difference and kind of negative things that happen out of this result. And so the work that I do and that we do as a city and as designers in practice is to figure out how we get out of those silos to really create an environment that brings together the sort of all the elements that make the public realm. This is an image from the city's neighborhood planning playbook, which is developed with Gale Architects and Good Design to talk about these silos and all these different decisions that are coming together to shape the city and to create our communities. And this is really the kind of the shift in mode of work that we have to be responsible to. So the Parks Department, the Housing Agency, the Economic Development Agency, the Planning Agency, et cetera, all kind of working and coordinating together to get better outcomes. And so the first project that I'm going to share with you with a prompt from Ellen Dunn Jones to kind of bring you with me to a place and have a walk is Hunters Point South. And so Hunters Point South is a major redevelopment project around 30 acres in New York City that's been happening over many decades, frankly. This, as you can see in this aerial image, was a former industrial site that had been sort of vacated over years, but still has this really prominent and prime location on the city's East River waterfront in Long Island City, Queens, across from Manhattan. And so this is sort of, young urban designer Justin's big break. And, when I was still in my 20s, I was very fortunate to be able to be the urban designer on what became the city's largest housing development project in the city since the 1970s, since the Starrett City development occurred. And just a quick background for this project is that, at one point this was going to be the Olympic Village site for the city's 2012 Olympics bid. The city did not win the Olympics, but the site was always sort of imagined by the then Bloomberg administration to be a sustainable community, right? The idea of building a new sustainable neighborhood for the city right across from Manhattan and in a prime location across from the UN. And so my initial urban design work on this project was to take this kind of rare opportunity in the city to have a large tract of contiguous publicly owned land that could be developed around multiple considerations. So this, the kind of the concept plan for how do we use our land, right? So back to those questions, what is it about, right? What are we trying to accomplish here? And so being able to accomplish, of course, a large amount of affordable housing was key, and figuring out the urban design framework that allowed for that. Being able to provide for much needed public facilities like schools and community spaces, but also being able to create connectivity, mobility, sustainability, and public space and public realm that accomplishes a lot of different types of uses, whether people uses or whether environmental and natural uses, to all come together through design into the project, and then doing all the different kinds of work across agencies to coordinate that through things like zoning and urban design controls, and then obviously then managing the kind of the public communication and visioning of a project. And so this is kind of a framework that was developed by the consultants that the city hired to ultimately fully develop the urban design of the project, which was R-Up Engineering, Weissman Freddie Architects, and Thomas Balsley Landscape Architects, which is now SWA Balsley. And the framework here was that this project, by design, created a context for creating an urban and sustainable community that connected the city to nature, that connected people to opportunity, and created really, I think, a kind of a unique landscape for what the future of a waterfront community in the city might look like. That's a major transition from its industrial past. So before I start the walking tour, I will just point out in this image, which was prepared by the consultants, you can see that this site, while it's a site of opportunity, like big 30 acres of vacant land, nothing is ever vacant, no place is empty, right? There's no colonial attitude here, right? There is a lot that existed here. There is a lot of infrastructure, like major tunnels and infrastructure under the site. There is an ecology here with the relationship of the East River, which is a tidal strait. There is an existing local community that was going to be impacted by this development. So this opportunity site is never empty, and we had to do the work of connecting all of those people and considerations through design. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and we have a video that I'm going to do a walking tour with all of you. Great. So this is a video that's sort of starting off, and it's really lucky. There's a nearby resident that looked at this site as it was being developed over time and did these time-lapse videos. And so what we see here is the development of this new park and public space. And what's important is that it outlines that this is an infrastructure, right? The growth and development of the city, it takes a lot of energy and effort to build the city, and how we do that is a challenge and a question. So in this image, you see that, the design of the things like the soccer field needed to be negotiated with the infrastructure for the park, addressing things like flooding, addressing things like transportation networks. So here we see that there's this bioswale, which was kind of one of my main design ideas for this neighborhood, was that Center Boulevard, which further to the north is just this sort of ocean of pavement. And this section transforms into this sort of multi-threaded kind of infrastructure for mobility and sustainability. And so things like bioswales are incorporated, kind of understanding that balance between hard and soft, between kind of pedestrian and nature are really developed. Another important consideration with this project, as I mentioned, there's all the infrastructure under the site. And so there's the work of kind of constructing elements. And all of these sort of subgrade conditions end up informing the kind of the public realm that's possible. So the big space where you can't build any buildings because of the subgrade conditions, we created what became the soccer field and turf for the park, but also for a new public school across the site. And so that's just sort of an overview of some of the work that's done that underlines an important point, which is that the investment and transformation that happens in a community like this is something that we have to acknowledge as a part of our work as urban designers. And so this is now our actual walking tour, and I apologize in advance. So this is literally me, with my mask on and everything, walking around the neighborhood with my phone. So it's not a produced video. It's imagine you're with me and we're just walking around the neighborhood, right? So this is kind of at the northern terminus of the park, and I'll be honest, I'm incredibly proud of this project. The work of urban design, and especially as a civil servant, right, a public designer, is that, we're making spaces for people, right? What is it about? It's about people. And so we come to the site, and as we're walking through, we see that all these different elements, right? The bioswales, we could see here, right? The kind of the design and detail and engineering of that provides greenery, but it also provides this great landscape for people that are able to enjoy. This is a kind of a garden connector that brings sort of a visual link between the neighborhood and the development to the city, and you can see that they've incorporated industrial elements from the site, kind of the original site, into the project. And so, in a project like this, there's a lot of community conversations that happen, and so thinking about things like programming of the site and the spaces were an incredibly involved process with community board meetings, connecting with local stakeholders, and asking what people want and need. And so things like providing for schools. So across the street here, this gray building is a new public school that sort of anchors the site. Active recreation, people wanted the ability to exercise and to have this sort of connection between the school and the park. And so importantly, though, the school, and this was a consideration at one point, should the school go in the park and be a separate thing and have a schoolyard? The design decision and kind of the community decision was actually to have the school be its own thing, and then the park and the public space, right, the playing fields, would be shared with the community. And so that's a kind of a conversation that you have to have, with people, and to have kind of a good understanding for how something like that will be maintained and operated. But as you can see, just from this walk along this spine, there's also sort of attention to the fact that there is a significant scale of new development in this neighborhood. So the program that was ultimately laid out and agreed to is 5,000 units of housing. And the urban design framework for this was that, yes, we'll have new development, but it's balanced by the significant investment in public space, significant investment for things like schools. And so, here where we have the big oval, the lawn, it's an incredible new space for the city. Kind of a inside knowledge thing is that there is literally a quote unquote turf war over this. So as you can see, the primary part of the oval is astroturf, artificial turf. And this is primarily because the school and the high number of users, it was a kind of a maintenance consideration. But, there are a lot of people in the community that wanted natural turf. And so there are all these conversations about how do we get that balance. And so in the design, there's actually a ring of natural turf that forms kind of an amphitheater around the natural turf. And so as we continue walking, you'll see that and there you see all the people kind of picnicking on the natural turf. As we continue walking, we'll see that the site is large. It's several blocks, 9 parcels in total of development, and it's significant. You can see the towers going up range between 25 and 40 stories. An important point is that the housing here is predominantly affordable housing. So the new housing was the basis for this entire project. There was a provision in the zoning that was approved at the time that the redevelopment happened that the housing would be at least 60% affordable housing. So a predominantly affordable housing development. The first phases of this project actually happened in kind of the 2008, 2009 kind of financial issue. And so the first developments actually were 100% affordable. So now as we're walking kind of further south on the site, you'll see these kind of strange conditions. So there's big beach-like volleyball place. This is that part of the site where there's significant infrastructure underneath the site. So the Amtrak tunnel, Queens Midtown tunnels, the power line that feeds Manhattan. And so this is where the kind of the programming and design did some kind of unique things to incorporate this artificial beach to create a kind of a neat and active use that takes what would be kind of a blank and dead space to become something instead active. Going back in history on this site, there was something called Water Taxi Beach at this location. So there was a water taxi landing and then kind of a concessionaire that put out sand and would do kind of fun things back when there was nothing around here. So this is also making sure to incorporate that kind of loved and existing community amenity into the new site, although relocated in a way to be here kind of at one of the more infrastructurally challenging parts of the site. So there's this sort of big transition between the kind of the character of different parts of the site. So kind of to the north where you see all the development and it's sort of a more active condition. We go to the southern part of the site, the character changes quite a bit. The future phases of development have not kind of yet come in, although we're starting to see construction. But the key is that regardless of kind of the shoreline, the use, there's always this kind of green spine that links this neighborhood together, right? This is the sort of the anchor for what will be community life. I mean, it's already an anchor for community life, even in advance of the development. But as the neighborhood builds out and grows, this is really kind of the space for people. So something that you'll notice as we're walking is that the shoreline condition here is incredibly rich. The decision to intentionally kind of keep that character was a source of many different conversations, and one that I and many others fought for, kind of having that variety and variability in shoreline and park and edge conditions as a part of the project. And so, the kind of the interest of this part of the site, this is kind of this anchor point that's sort of between the two different characters and divisions. And I'm crossing the street now to what was a green connector. You may have noticed in the site plan, there's a sort of green connector that goes through the site. And this was to provide kind of a break and a breather between what will eventually be, frankly, a significant number of new towers and development. But this green connector has sort of natural spaces, kind of smaller scale, neighborhood scale, public spaces. You can see people are already kind of picnicking there. and that this will provide sort of a break and a respite that eventually connects people then to the water. And of course, you can see there's the incredible skyline condition as well. And so as we're walking, this is kind of the part of the site that is not, yet built and developed. It's still very much in process, but there is significant infrastructure work done by the city. The city's Department of Economic Development, the EDC, took control of this project, and we're sort of fortunate that there was kind of one entity that across administrations, across different agencies could sort of spearhead the project. And so the big commitment here was that all of this infrastructure of the streets were sort of put in place in advance of development. So like there's already a community here, and this infrastructure that was put in place is green infrastructure. So what I'm pointing out in this image here just looks like concrete. The concrete on the right is permeable concrete. So there are a lot of environmental performance considerations put into this project. And so in areas where we wanted to make sure that we had greater infiltration, there was, for the first time, a kind of a neighborhood scale use of permeable concrete. And so these are the kinds of things, like if this were just a straight housing development or a straight especially an affordable housing development, these kind of more innovative features wouldn't have been incorporated. And so the new development going in, we see it is this sort of tower context. The way the project works is it was 130-acre site. The city built the park, 11 acres. The streets get carved out and built by the city, and we were left with these multiple parcels that are developed through an RFP process. So the city's Economic Development Corporation and Department of Housing, Preservation and Development have this framework of putting these sites out for competitive bid with the requirement that they be at least 60% affordable housing. But then other controls and considerations go into the evaluation of those designs. And so one of those criteria is that I and folks with different agencies developed a set of design guidelines that control how those RFP projects are evaluated. So even after we're gone and the zoning and community processes are over, there's a mechanism by virtue of the design guidelines to ensure that we get the kind of community that we want. So here we're kind of now into the neighborhood, looking back through the street network, past the school, and toward this future phase of development. And here we're in a different sort of condition. This is the end of 2nd Street, which goes down to the Newtown Creek side of the waterfront, and this is a very different character. And so here the kind of the interest was to create this connection from the street. So you see all the neighborhood above to bring people down to the water and to address this sort of drastic grade change that we see in the city, or in the neighborhood rather. And so something that I'll point out here is across the creek is the Greenpoint and Williamsburg rezoning. So this is also a project I worked on when I was at city planning. And Greenpoint Williamsburg was a different model. This was private development that had some affordable housing, but it's 20 to 25% affordable housing in some of these buildings. And overall, I think it was the city tried to reach a 33% target, but many of the developments are 20 to 25% affordable housing. And so there, we just have a totally different model from what we're seeing at Manhattan. What am I pointing out here? Oh, I'm pointing out the CSO. So this is a combined sewer overflow and existing CSO that through the design and development of the Hunters Point South project, we were able to reduce the kind of the negative environmental impact on things like CSO events, even though we have a significant amount of new development. So headed back up, and you can see the designers did a really great job of kind of creating a real variety, a mix of conditions for these sites. This part isn't as populated because the buildings aren't here yet, but once the buildings are here, there's this sort of kind of public realm opportunity. And at the same time, providing that there is continuity. So there's a development site to our right, and the city as a part of the park and public realm built out this continuous network of green space to link the projects. So this is really in kind of contrast to other waterfront developments in the city that are kind of privately initiated. So again, this is the southern part of the site where we're at this sort of wonderful expanse and confluence of the Newtown Creek and the East River joining. And it just provides these really, rare and beautiful kind of ways to connect nature and the city in a unique way. Actually, in the distance of the image there is Stuyvesant Town, Peter Cooper Village, which was sort of an impetus for this project. And so as you can see, there are many different layers and levels to this site and to this project. And kind of the design idea was to create, different scales of space and different moments. If we're adding 5,000 units, approximately 15,000 people, we need a public realm that can service many different types of people and different types of users. And so one of the things that was incorporated through conversations with community and with the designers is this active recreation area, fitness area. So this is where people can come and use public workout equipment, and it's like the best gym in New York City, right? With these incredible views. So again, in the background here, again, the commitment to actually invest in public infrastructure. So that's a new public school that is being built in advance of the new buildings coming in, right? So being kind of having some foresight on the needs of this community. And again, the kind of the network of pathways that link us in and through the site. So this is at the southernmost point, and it's important that you see that we're actually very high up. We're sort of 30 feet above the water, and this is sort of what colloquially became known as the point of Hunter's Point. It was not a natural kind of case. A lot of this is fill from the tunnels being built long ago, but this topography was something that people in the community did know and connect with, and it creates this sort of wonderful opportunity for people to have this sort of destination space as a part of their park. And as you can see, it's already well used, even in advance of new development coming in. But that point, that promontory, has this great kind of relationship with what is a sort of a designed and engineered wetland below. So we have this sort of mix of conditions between the more kind of human focused spaces like the sloping lawn that can be used for viewing and picnics and movie screenings and things of that nature. The designers, again, Balsley, Weissman, Freddie, kind of provided these sort of platform spaces that are a neat kind of feature. But we're sort of always between this sort of kind of urban and populated space and these more natural and kind of passive spaces. And so we're headed now kind of back toward the site, and this is where there is this important kind of opportunity to take advantage of the topography. And just one quick anecdote that I'll say about the topography is that this is one of the kind of the battles that I've won on this project, in that early in the development, there are a lot of different consultants and experts and builders and all these people that were saying that it would be better to just level the site, right? Just get everything the same level, be easier, and it makes every condition. But I fought hard to make sure that the topography was kept. And it's great that the design team came in and created this sort of promontory point as a part of the project. So now, to save a little time, we sort of jumped back So I'm going to do a quick loop around the waterfront side of the site. And so this is, again, one of these important connector spaces. That's that initial rail garden that sort of brings people from the neighborhood to the waterfront, and making sure that we're really just, again, what is it about? About people. We're providing these kind of wonderful places for people to rest, take in the view, do their social media posts, all of these kind of conditions that really are what the city is about, right? We're here to kind of create these dynamic conditions and to serve as many different people as possible. Something that I'll say that, when we're designing a space like this, thinking about who this is for was really, really critical. And, even though the project had the housing, we wanted to make sure that this was a truly public space and a truly public realm, right? That it's designed for everyone, that it's welcoming to everyone. And I think we were able to accomplish that here. A lot of waterfront redevelopment spaces in the city, for a lot of different reasons, have not been able to accomplish that. But here, with the new development and with the design of this park, I think we've kind of created a new piece and part of New York City that is truly inclusive. So when everyone loves to talk about equity and design and equity and community planning and development, it's challenging to do that, right? It's challenging to have had some of the conversations about, who could be here, young kids playing basketball, or, what about crime, and what about all these different things, right? By designing a space that kind of combines people, brings this sort of mix of users and activity, we're able to get some good outcomes. I think what I was pointing out here with me zigzagging back between the field and the water is that during Superstorm Sandy, this entire park was inundated. And because long before Superstorm Sandy, right, we were doing this in 2007 or so, we thought about climate change and sea level rise, before everybody thought it was cool. And so this park was actually designed for water to come in and flood, right? And to sort of ensure that all the infrastructure and components can be sort of returned to use quickly following a storm. And so this AstroTurf field, which serves its function and purpose, is also able to be a form of sustainability and resilience infrastructure for the city. So almost done with the tour here, and this is kind of a walk around to what was an existing platform. Again, so this is all like on structure and piles, so it's there are constraints for what we could do with the design, but the idea and attitude was that we should have plenty of public seating, public activities here. Amanda Burden was the planning commissioner at the time, and so she was absolutely fascinated, if not obsessed, with the idea that seating is what makes a great public space. And so throughout this project, in every kind of mode and way possible, we tried to accommodate this. So Weissman and Freddie, again, were the architects on that part of the project. And so here at the water taxi landing, East River Ferry landing, the idea was to kind of create this kind of great gateway and anchor point for the park. And so there's this wonderful canopy that they designed with this sort of sawtooth section. And the sawtooth is because on top are solar panels that help feed lighting for the park. But the reason is really to kind of make that experience of getting from the ferry landing, which is kind of further out where the water is deep, and making kind of a more pleasant connection up into the neighborhood where people are connecting. And so it kind of helps create kind of a place and frame the space and make for this really kind of wonderful waterfront edge condition. And again, we can see that everyone is here, all sorts of people, people from the neighborhood, people not from the neighborhood, black people, white people, brown people, immigrants, tourists, old timers, everyone is here, right? By design. And it's important that it be a consideration that designers actively kind of talk about and think about who are you designing for? How do your decisions kind of make that happen? Again, right? Sense of place. How do we talk about equity? You know, what are the details? And how do we kind of ensure that we're creating spaces that are comfortable, even in a pandemic? So that's my walking tour. That was a complete experiment that you all were just a part of. So I hope you kind of enjoyed that segment of the work, and I'll return to that when we get to the Q&A. But the kind of the framework of that work at Hunters Point South, and really generally what we try to do with urban design in the city, is to think of all the different scales, all the different considerations, right? From grassroots to government, from, you know, thinking about climate resilience through to how do we ensure long-term affordability in our neighborhoods, are all kind of coming together in how we resolve things through design. So I'm going to go back to my presentation, and I'm going to shift gears pretty significantly, and that I'm going to share kind of a quick version of history, and then some of the work that I've done independent from my role or hat in city government with Urban Patch. So you all are in architecture school or built environment practice or interested in architecture and urbanism, and there's a conversation happening now about kind of our frames of reference, history, the canon. At Columbia, we've called it unlearning whiteness, right? So all that we're taught is kind of the basis for what we know about architecture and design and urbanism. And this work that I'm about to share is sort of an attempt and prompt to begin that work of looking at other people and other examples and other ideas as being valuable in our work. So I shared this earlier, I won't read it again, but this is, again, Flanner House, a Black community organization in Indianapolis, talking about change and design in their neighborhood and what that looked like. You know, what is it about? And so one of the people that was a part of Flanner House is this gentleman. His name is Albert Allen Moore, and he was my grandfather. And he was, for his day, kind of a urban agriculturalist, for lack of a better term. And so what he did for the Flanner House was he ran a large-scale garden program in the city. So this is an image of one of the farm spaces that my grandfather and the Flanner House operated. And this isn't out in the country somewhere. This is actually in the city. It's on 12th Street in Indianapolis. And these farm programs were done to really create sort of opportunities to address a lot of the challenges that this Black, low-income, marginalized, and segregated community had, like providing for fresh food and jobs and opportunities for young people. They also created a sort of an infrastructure for health and kind of social interaction by creating, for example, a canning facility where they could can the food grown in their farms and gardens, which numbered over 600 farms and gardens in total, backyard gardens and plots, and served, you know, hundreds of families. And, you know, as they're kind of doing this work, they're creating, you know, interesting spaces and interesting kind of innovations in design. So this is a demonstration kitchen that they built into their community center so that they could teach people how to cook healthy foods, right? So this is a low-income Black community that had issues like food deserts, issues like diabetes and diet-related diseases, obesity, asthma. Sound familiar, right? You know, there were people that were innovating and developing ways to do this. And a way that they kind of entered this work was by thinking about people, right? What is it about people? And so in the kind of work that they did, the image on the left is a sociogram where they went and talked to the people and the families in the neighborhood and figured out what did they have in common? What were their mutual kind of choices and kind of conditions? Where were their needs? Where were their kind of assets? And when they did that, they got together and they created this incredible plan called the Fall Creek Homes. So there was a part of the city that was a all-black part of the city that needed significant investment and had a number of poor outcomes, and they planned and designed and built and executed a black-led, black-built, black-designed, black-planned neighborhood of their own, called Fall Creek Homes, and implemented through the Flanner House. And the basis for this neighborhood plan was that families, all these people that they connected with, would be able to contribute their labor toward building equity in the homes, right? So this is a model that was done previously with Quaker communities. The Flanner House worked closely with the Quaker community in developing this program. But this is in the early 1950s. So this is long before Habitat for Humanity came up with their kind of sweat equity housing model. These black people in Indianapolis in the early 50s did it for 300 homes and at scale long before that model existed. Another important point is that this was designed by black people. So Hilliard Robinson, who's a black architect that hopefully some of you will know, was the architect for this project. And he provided these sort of adaptable, very modern kind of kit plans that people could adapt what they wanted to see with their house. So here's sort of a framework, and they're choosing their layout and choosing their window pattern and choosing their siding and kind of creating this variability in this neighborhood as people were designing and building their homes using Robinson's templates. And so this is just kind of an overview of what that is and what it looked like. This is the Fall Creek Homes area is outlined in red. Again, this would have been considered the black slum of the community. Outlined in orange is Lockfield Gardens, which is one of the first federally subsidized public housing developments, and one of the first federally subsidized public housing developments designed for segregation for black people. Right, so these are these sort of two models, difference in design, right, of opposition for how to do this work. And so the Flanner House homes were built and constructed. It included a plan for the open spaces for the park along the waterfront to deal with issues of flooding that we're seeing in that community, and of course to build out all of these self-help, self-build housing developments. And when we go forward to today, we see these two different models and again, the difference in opposition. The Fall Creek Homes area that was planned, designed, and built by black people was able to maintain and sustain. Things like the tower in the park, your model of public housing had declined, and you can see that a significant amount of it was demolished for things like parking lots and monorails for a university. The housing that remained has been emptied out and is now gentrified for people who aren't black to be able to live close to downtown. Yet the Flanner House Homes area remains, and to this day it is still an affordable community in downtown Indianapolis where we still have a black population. So inspired by that work, I've done kind of work in our community. So I'm from this neighborhood. It's called Mapleton Fall Creek and Meridian Kessler. And so we were inspired by this great history of black people developing and designing and planning their communities, and decided to try to do something in our community. So here in red is Delaware, here in green is Park. This was a vacant house and a vacant lot that we had the simple idea to improve them, to make it better, and then we would continue doing that work through other projects in the neighborhood. So Urban Patch is literally an urban patch. It's this sort of patchwork of projects for improving housing and open spaces in our community. What that looks like is this. It's a simple kind of project, but not really. These were one of the many vacant, long vacant homes in the neighborhood, and we simply fixed it up and do that in a way that provides affordable housing in the community, not gentrification housing in the community. And it's not easy to do that, right? There are reasons that this work was hard. It was hard to get, the house repaired. It was hard to get financing because this is still a Black neighborhood and they don't like giving Black people loans in Black neighborhoods. But we persevered and made it work. Simultaneously, we're also doing this work again with all this vacant land and sort of chronic disinvestment to do improvements in proximity to our housing improvements. And so this is where we worked with people in the community, with the community garden group and church groups and others to take this vacant space and turn it into a community garden, and including sort of a placemaking component, right? This idea of investing in place, which is the sunflower mural. My brother is the artist, but we worked with students from the local high school, from Shortridge High School, that are seen here helping install the mural, and the idea of kind of creating place with community and work. But creating place with community takes a lot of different forms, and Urban Patch engages in all of that. So as we're rehabbing these old houses, we're making sure to hire people from the community. So there's participation there. As we're doing our garden projects, we're kind of looking, what we call bringing the past forward, looking to what Flannery House did in doing things like canning, which is a way for different demographics of people that are now living in this neighborhood to come together around their common needs, like food access. Or even doing things to improve environment. This is our Indie Redbud project, where we gave all different kinds of families, old timers, newcomers, everybody could sign this little contract and get a free tree, with the idea that they were all going to contribute to the beautification of their neighborhood, but also addressing the neighborhood's urban tree canopy issue that's leading to heat island effect. And finally, something we're really proud of is that we've continued working with the Flannery House to kind of revive that history. You can see my grandfather here is on the side of this building, Cleo's Bodega, which is a new neighborhood scale fresh food, grocery, and cafe. Where now in this neighborhood, Black neighborhood, we have access to fresh food and a cafe for people to get that food access. My grandfather, way back in the day, he ran the neighborhood cooperative grocery that had since closed, and so this is a way to bring that back. But this time, the cooperative grocery is put kind of next door to this new urban orchard where people can glean and collect food from all the fruit trees in the orchard, kind of connected by providing these new spaces, things like free Wi-Fi and all of that for young people and residents to enjoy. Right? So, thinking of this work, kind of returning to this, what is about people, the jobs they do, all of these are important kind of references for my work. I'll end finally with kind of a quick run through where we've essentially started doing this work as well in other contexts. So this is work that I'm connected with in Kigali, Rwanda. And so many of you probably know Rwanda from the genocide, which happened over 25 years ago now. But the nation has been kind of rebuilding, and especially in its capital city, Kigali, that is kind of looking forward to what a future of development there looks like. And so I'm bringing Urban Patch to Kigali. It's a similar question and model, which is how do we see urban design, planning, development in a way that contributes there. So here, the kind of the model is an adaptation from the early Fall Creek Homes Flannery House model, where there's this sort of revolving fund that can help produce and generate housing. That takes a lot of different points in consideration, and this is the urban design side, right? Like, okay, there's the plan and the design, but there are all these things that you have to factor in. Looking at sites and issues like zoning and policy, looking at the financial models, kind of understanding the balances for what's possible and what's possible in different places and different contexts. That could be context around land values, context around the actual terrain and environment that need to be reconciled into a project. And so what our development and model here is to find ways to build affordable housing without government subsidy in desirable neighborhoods instead of in less desirable places or less service places in the city. So what we've been able to do is to, through increasing density in what is a kind of a higher income McMansion type neighborhood in Kigali, to incorporate new condominium development. An important part of this work is that we're sort of building in a framework that increases density, but still provides for a quality of space and a quality of design. And while we're doing that, we're making sure that the full scales of sustainability incorporated. So using less cement by using this roll-lock bond construction method is a way to lower the cost, but also the environmental impact of using more concrete in the design, right? And these bricks that are there can be locally produced, that it can provide for jobs, reduce carbon footprint, et cetera. But it also provides for many different types of job opportunities for different people in this work. So we're looking at all of the different kind of components of urban design and urban development to see how we can increase impact in every way possible through our development and design. And we've recently completed the project. And so, 8 units, kind of a pilot project building to show how you can get 8 units on what would have been a 1 single family unit site. 3 units of those are completely affordable housing. I kept 1 for myself. And the others are kind of market rate, but it's a way to build in sustainability and a mix of incomes in a place that normally wouldn't have had it. The final kind of piece before I stop and we move to questions is that, as Scott mentioned, I'm a member of an organization called Black Space, which is a group of Black urban designers, planners, artists, economic development people, lots of different disciplines focused on the needs of Black communities and Black cities. So you can find us at blackspace.org on social media. Blackspace.org is our website. And it's important to kind of think about elevating the work of Black planners and designers and development as we're thinking about changing our cities and communities as we're all experiencing today. And so I just briefly wanted to share that if you go to the Black Space website, I want to encourage you to look at our Black Space Manifesto, which this is work that we've done over the years and working in and with different Black communities to think about ways that we can see better outcomes, more equitable outcomes as we're looking at design, urban design, planning, development, et cetera, in Black communities. Things like moving at the speed of trust, right? Growing together as you do projects. Centering lived experiences of people. So when work is happening in different neighborhoods, how you kind of center people's experience. Planning with and designing with, right? This deconstructing the designer, the architect, or whoever is as the expert with the knowledge, but really understanding that there's a broader group of people that are designers, are planners, are developers, and that we need to find better ways to connect with, communicate with, and collaborate with people across the spectrum. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing. I'll just say that there is a Black Space Atlanta that has recently just started. So definitely go to our website and get in touch for those of you that are in Atlanta, and we can connect you with the wonderful Black Space Atlanta crew. And with that, I'm all set.
Thanks, Justin. So I wanted to get Joel to join us now. Joel, if you're out there, maybe you could maybe turn your camera on and go through some of the questions and start asking some of the questions.
Well, first of all, I just want to say, Justin, thank you for your fantastic presentation. It's hard to give a round of applause right now because we are all virtual, but I'm sure everyone is really excited and glad that you joined us today. First, my name is Joel Jesu. I had the fantastic opportunity of getting my MArch degree at Georgia Tech. And later, I was fully convinced to go get my MSUD. And currently, I'm a teaching assistant in the MSUD program. And also on this outside that, I'm involved in private urban design consulting. So I'll be taking us through the questions. The questions are really exciting questions. So Justin, get ready. But before I ask our first question, I just want to ask for myself. How in the world did you get involved as a 20-year-old, get involved in this project that would later turn out to be one of the most amazing projects in New York? And secondly, how in the world did you find yourself in Rwanda? I just gotta ask.
So the first response is that I tell people I've never had a bad boss. I'm very lucky. And so when I graduated from Columbia, so I also graduated with both a Master Architecture and Master Urban Design. So it's literally in your shoes. I had a choice, honestly. I could go work for, my job opportunity at the time was with SOM, to work kind of as an architect in SOM, probably doing like more big architecture than urban design, or to work in city government. And I had a great mentor at the time. Scott would know her, Moji Bartloo, who taught in the urban design program at Columbia, kind of encouraged me to work in government because I could learn a lot and work on kind of a broader range of projects at that stage in my career. And so I worked in city planning initially, and I was assigned, I was an urban designer, and I was assigned essentially to work on waterfront projects. So Greenpoint in Williamsburg was my first kind of project as an urban designer, and it was a big project. It was like a lot, but like I said, fortunately, I had a ton of support from people in the planning department, and including all the way up to the planning commissioner at the time. Amanda Burden was the city planning commissioner, and she was incredibly focused on the value of urban design and making New York City a great city. And so this sort of high-level leadership and investment in urban design was really key to, frankly, empowering people like myself to be able to have opportunities for impact. And so as these big projects are moving through, I had become the de facto waterfront urban design person. And so when Hunters Point South came, I was simply assigned as the urban designer on this project. It was wild, I'll be honest. Because, there was good leadership in the city, people valued design, and I was able to kind of have a direct impact. So Sean Donovan was the housing commissioner at the time. So Sean Donovan is an architect by background, but he was the housing commissioner. And Dan Doctoroff was the deputy mayor, who also kind of had an interest in design. So I was 20-something years old in meetings with Sean Donovan and Dan Doctoroff and Amanda Burden with my sketches. It was a little wild. To figure out this project, and they believed in me and what I was trying to do, it was great to just have that kind of support. So that's the first. The second is for Rwanda. I just had a friend, Fatu Die is her name. So she works. She also was kind of an architect, urban designer. And she had a career transition where she went from working in the U.S., where frankly, as a Black woman in the U.S., she had trouble getting work or getting a break, and was tired of having kind of crappy work and jobs. And people in Rwanda said, come here. And so my friend Fatu moved to Rwanda. I worked in the city government as an urban designer and urban planner there, worked on a lot of their housing and development policies, and eventually moved on to work for an NGO called SCAT Consulting, which does this work with kind of housing development, sustainable economy, and manufacturing. So that's where the connection to BRIC. So I just was visiting my friend Fatu and have been to Rwanda a couple times, and it's incredible what's happening in Rwanda and in East Africa in general in terms of people kind of using design and connecting that with things like sustainable development. And so I started doing work there.
Good. Thank you, Justin. I grew up, I was born and raised not too far from that site that you talked about. So it gets me really excited to see that you did some work there. So one question that I think would be appropriate to discuss at this time is, how do you see the fight or the struggle to protect urban space as an urban designer or as an architect play or find its place in improving social justice issues in America or in the world in general? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so a lot of people would put this under the umbrella of the right to the city, right? If you talk about kind of like the global conversation that happens not just in the US, but really everywhere, there's this premise of who has the right to the city. And what do we even define as city is an important conversation. And so, there's a very long history to this, that parts of the city that are affiliated or associated with Black people, people of African descent, people of color, immigrant people, low-income people, right? They don't have as much right to their city as others. And so as we're kind of trying to navigate that and to elevate conversations about that, I think the work that has to be done is to get as many different types of people, different disciplines, different sectors, different people in different levels of agency and power to understand that this is a problem that harms all. And that's not the case in most cities and most societies, that there is this major disconnect between kind of the shared and the common and the collective, and that it affects everyone, including the people with more power. And so I think in the work that we try to do in New York City, at least, the work that I'm trying to do, frankly, in my own home community in Indianapolis and in Rwanda, is to create a framework where we actually use space itself to help people understand that, right? Places themselves, right? So there's geography, there's environment. But then once you project people into that, you can have a conversation about place and about community, right? And things like inequality, things like environmental impact, whether that's, in the case of kind of green environment, but kind of social environment, that we need to get more people to kind of think and speak in that mode and to work more collaboratively. And so in a big project like Hunters Point South, right, that was happening in a big, the hammer of government and, billions of dollars kind of mode, but that also can happen in a totally different scale, right? The tree planting project I showed at Urban Patch, it was that whether you're the new gentrifier that just moved into the neighborhood and you're, a white upper income person, or you've lived in this neighborhood for 3 generations and this, you've owned this house forever, you're going to get this, you're both going to plant this tree and you're going to sign this contract that says you're going to take care of this tree, right? Everybody is doing the same work and has responsibility for a community outside of their own personal interests. So it's hard work. That's not how anybody is wired in American society, unfortunately. But we have to demonstrate and show people that that's possible. And it can translate, like I said, from grassroots to government to kind of create that framework for conversation about design and community change.
Right. Justin, thank you for that. There's lots of questions about just kind of the mechanism of achieving affordability, in a sense that, how do you, it's hard to imagine affordability in New York. Like in your head, New York, affordability, not equal. They don't meet, right? And so I think there's a lot of questions here, like how does the affordable housing stay affordable? And will it continue to be that way throughout kind of as the project ages, right? And of course, what mechanisms did you all use to actually achieve that? Because here in Atlanta, a lot of developers would say, well, we can't really make the numbers meet. It just doesn't work. And of course, ultimately, trying to define in that situation, what is affordability? Is it a percentage of income? Because in Atlanta, percentages of income usually work as opposed to dollar amounts, because, as you know, that dollar amount in New York and that dollar amount in Atlanta are drastically different. So do you mind talking a little bit about just affordability and the mechanisms of how you all got there?
Sure. Yeah, this is important. And affordability was the cornerstone of the Hunters Point South project that I shared. So it was a unique situation because the city owned all of the land and the city committed to build all the infrastructure. So it's not a typical case. In most of New York City, it's predominantly privately owned land, and there may be things like zoning controls or tax incentives that are used to develop affordable housing based on different kind of federal, state, and local kind of housing development programs. In this case, it was city ownership of the land. And so with the ownership of the land, you have a lot of control, right? So the city owns the land and they say you cannot build here unless you're building housing that meets XYZ criteria. And that gets bundled with things like tax incentives, et cetera. And so because the city had ownership of the land, they are able to ensure that the housing is permanently affordable housing. So this is an important point. So I think I mentioned at some point that, there's Stuyvesant Town, Peter Cooper Village. Every so often the city has to go back in and put tax incentives or make some kind of deal or subsidies to keep that housing affordable. Because when that housing was built, there was no legal mechanism to ensure permanent affordability. So in Hunters Point South, because this was publicly owned land and because this was the framework that it was developed, everything built in the footprint of Hunters Point South has a requirement for 60% affordable housing at a minimum permanently. So not after the 25 or 30-year tax abatement goes out, not when the building gets renovated, permanently affordable attached to the land. That is the legal mechanism. And so other cities where there's public land in play, they need to stop just giving away stuff and saying, okay, this is fine for 20 years. You have to have legal mechanisms for permanent affordability tied to the land, right? When everything, the way, the world is set up in the West, at least, things follow the land. Now, in terms of the income levels for then how do we define affordability is a broader conversation. And so we do in New York, and I think in most cities by now that are tied to some kind of federal or state program, it's based on area median incomes. And then the affordability of the housing is then connected to a percentage of your income. So it is connected as a percentage and not a set dollar amount. In the Hunters Point South case, so there are different bands of income affordability. So some affordability is at what we call the low income band, so below 80% of median, or even as low as 40% of median in some cases. Because New York's median income is quite high, sometimes we go as low as 40% of median. But then there are bands. So the idea is in this neighborhood, you're not reconcentrating poverty by saying we're going to build all very low income housing in one. Anybody that's read a book know that doesn't work, right? So by design, Hunters Point South has different bands. So there's some that are low income, there's some that are middle income, and some that are moderate income, all kind of mixed into this development. And there were important conversations that happened because, for example, in New York City, a sanitation worker, like somebody empties trash cans for the city, makes $70,000 a year, right? So you know, the idea of who needed affordable housing was a little bit more complicated in New York because there's a lot of affordable housing provided for very, very low incomes, but there isn't a lot of affordable housing built at what are considered sort of the moderate and kind of middle income ranges. And so there's a kind of, again, this balancing where you're, instead of just saying, well, this is only going to be a middle income neighborhood, this is only going to be a wealthy neighborhood with a smattering of affordable housing, or this is only going to be a low income neighborhood. In Hunters Point South, by design, we've kind of stacked in kind of multiple income ranges that create the kind of the mix and diversity that ensure that that neighborhood stays a neighborhood long term and not be you know, the projects of the future, to be blunt.
Right. So Justin, in what ways did such, you know, you talked about a very respected group of designers that worked on this project, right? You know, ranging from some of your consultants to the, you know, lead designers. And a question here that is coming in is saying, in what ways did such a desperate group of designers engage with members of such a large community? So do you mind sharing with us, when you said you engaged the community, what did that mean? What did that look like with designers and I guess some of the team from the city that you were directly working with?
Yeah, good question and important point. So design happens, I think I was saying earlier, kind of in a much broader way. And this was a part of a planning process as well, right? It was not only a design process, it was a planning process. So I was a designer in a planning agency. And so a lot of the work with the community goes back decades, actually, right? So there are people in the city's planning department, people in various city agencies, people in what are called community boards in New York that have been talking about this site in its many different fits and starts for decades and generations. So there was a lot of embodied kind of knowledge with certain key people working on this project. And so when we did the community engagement, it was done as a city, right? So this is people of the city planning department, economic development, parks department, transportation department, going out to community boards, to community groups, all in advance of the formal planning and zoning process moving forward. So that's like a multi-year process and project, right? No, you know, the fancy architects and landscape architects aren't around yet, right? Because frankly, the way our field and discipline is set up, which needs to change, is that there's no mechanism for them to be paid to be around, right? So they're not there.
Right.
And so all of that work was done by government, right, in advance. And then kind of once things get to a certain stage and there's a level of understanding and agreement with community, then one set of consultants, so there's a different set of consultants, Fox and Fowl architects, came in and developed sort of different schemes based on community input. That led to the actual public process of rezoning the land, which was to change the zoning from manufacturing to mixed use, and to map the park to create the new public park and to create the public streets. So that was, I don't even know how many community meetings, it was a lot, that were done with the interface of government through the public sector, right? Not through developer, there were no developers yet, right? This is purely the public having a conversation about change in the community, entirely absent of developers, right? So this is important. Like there is this break because the responsibility is different, right, than when you may have a more developer-driven process. So we developed all that, and that was kind of the framework that determined the program, the park, the layout, all these kind of concepts that I was talking about with how the landscape was going to be developed and designed all happened with myself, people in the planning department, and with community members. And then that was moved forward into kind of a public approval. After that point, then that's when Weissman, Freddie, and Balsley and all these people were hired. And of course, if you were to Google this, no, my name doesn't show up. Their names show up. They are these firms, and they have marketing departments. There's no credit given at all to the public. And so, I mean, this is a problem, but it's just sort of the way it is. You know, they were kind of building on a framework that involved a large community process that then they went back as they were developing more detailed designs to return to those same community groups and different stakeholders and the agency, the kind of client agency, we call it, to develop a finalized design. But part of the reason those designers were hired is because they had a good understanding and relationship with the community. So Thomas Balsley, for example, had designed portions of the park further to the north. And so he actually knew kind of some of the background and framework for what the community was looking for as well.
You know, Justin, we look at projects like Hunters Point Park. And of course, the immediate thought begins, how in the world was this paid for, right? And so I think some of the questions that are coming in are, you know, for example, Ellen Dunham-Jones' question is, it's wonderful to see great investment in public space. Is there any particular mechanism in place that helps pay for long-term maintenance? Or is it just treated as one of, you know, another park under kind of the city's usual kind of management? And I think there's another question I think that we could couple with that, and maybe you'd respond to it the same. Bill Tano is asking, how was Hunters Point South project funded? You know, was it all funded by the public, or was there, you know, can you, you know, talk a little bit about how that funding process worked with individual developers and the city working together? So I think those two questions, maybe you could talk about. Yeah, right.
Yeah, so generally the funding, again, it's a pretty unique project. So it was all city land. So the funding is the fact that there was city land and there was a decision for how that incredible resource of, you know, millions of square feet of generated development was going to be used, right? So it's city funded, both city capital dollars. So the city spending, you know, the millions of dollars to build the streets, to build the park, et cetera. But then there's also the asset of the city owned land that was being used to generate value, right? So the land was zoned M, and, you know, per square foot that city owned land is worth one thing. You rezone it so that you can do 12 FAR of residential, and suddenly that land becomes significantly more valuable, right? It's like printing money, frankly, right? So the city did do some capital money to do things like build a street and park and all that, but it also, through rezoning and land use change, essentially printed money, right, to realize a certain type of project. And so the way it works is the city used it, you know, kind of fronted the capital project money to build the streets, build the park, build the infrastructure in advance of development, right? So the park and everything, the streets were all built before there are any buildings generating anything, right? So that was an upfront cost that the city needed to factor into its overall city capital budget. You know, for reference, New York City's, well, not anymore, but, you know, before everything had just happened, the city would spend $10 billion a year on capital projects, right? So the city has a large budget. It was a $90 billion annual budget for the city. So they're spending that money to create the value, right, with the infrastructure. And then the individual development parcels, the parcels A through G, those are still publicly owned land that have controls on them. So one of the controls is a requirement for affordable housing. Another control is a requirement that those developments pay into a fund that helps pay to maintain the park. And so there are dedicated funds for the maintenance of that park. There's within the city parks department kind of a friends of group, so a small park conservancy to ensure that the things that are sort of more than your typical New York City park, which there are several, do have things like staffing, gardeners, maintenance staff, additional maintenance from reserve funds to keep the site in good repair. That is not funded just by general tax money. It does have dedicated funding from the development. So it's connected, right? That the neighborhood and the public realm are in conversation with one another. And, there were multiple objectives laid out, and there was a balancing act. More affordable. Do we have a better public space? And that was a conversation that was had with community, and frankly, that happens with each development site. So each development parcel goes through an RFP process kind of over time, and those are kind of independent negotiations around affordability, city subsidy and tax dollars, how much money goes to the park. A lot of different things are being negotiated at once.
I see. Thank you. And Justin, what do you think is the perception of, the taxpayers in New York City about the outcome since, Hunters Point was, paid for by tax dollars? And do you think Hunters Point will now become a model of the way you all thought about the community engagement, the funding processes, the execution plan? Do you think that is going to be a model for all your future projects?
So it's hard for it to be a model because having a big piece of clearly valuable land is not typical. It is being looked at as a model for other projects in different ways. So like the Sunnyside Yards is another area actually nearby in Queens that there's a large amount of public land that is going to see development in the future, and that this kind of model where the city does things like public realm and public infrastructure in advance of development is being looked at. Yes, but it's not a broadly applicable model just because it is pretty rare now that you have a lot of high value public land that's left. In other cities, it's certainly a model that other cities can look at. Like if you have public land, a large piece of valuable public land in Atlanta, I don't know if there are, but you might want to consider looking at it because there are different things that come with the ownership of the land. So that's kind of one piece, and I think the other kind of consideration in terms of models is I think that in this project there were multiple scales of design and community engagement that were happening. So there's community engagement at the scale of the conversation around affordable housing, right? And that was an important and ongoing conversation. There's community engagement at the scale of the creation of the park, the urban design and zoning of the massing of buildings, right? So there are different kind of scales of engagement that were required. And there was, what I think is going to be a future model is that there were kind of all the agencies were in each of the steps together. So I started the presentation with like all the silos of government, and typically it would be city planning would do the zoning. Yeah, you can build towers, 12 FAR, and then it cuts, and then the housing agency, okay, here's the RFP, and then the parks agency, okay, we'll build the park. In this case, all the agencies from the beginning through to today work in lockstep and in concert and are a part of all the different conversations, so that as they're each doing their independent work that is the scope of their agency, they're able to kind of coordinate and get a much better outcome and a more consistent outcome that brings those different elements of community engagement and input into the different phases of process.
So Justin, as you know, there is a real question here about gentrification. And so at Hunters Point, How did you all think about gentrification in that whole project? And if you speak broadly, just speaking about how do you improve housing without gentrification?
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard. I mean, in Hunters Point South, like I said, it's a significantly different conversation because 60% of those units are affordable housing, and so by law, forever, as long as that land is there, the majority of the people that live there will be, 60%, which is a majority, will be in the affordable housing range, and so a community like Hunters Point South. And Long Island City, which is adjacent to it, has already seen significant gentrification. And one of the reasons why, frankly, this property was sort of targeted for this particular housing program is that the existing makeup of that community was this relatively new built neighborhood, a relatively established kind of upland community, and then it was all industrial land. So the gentrification, if there was a vacant site here for 30 years, like you're not gentrifying anyone because no one lives there. And so the context here is a little different. In Greenpoint and Williamsburg, it's totally different situation, right? There you have new development, which yes, it has some affordable housing, but the scale and impact of a significant amount of new market rate housing put significant pressures on that neighborhood. When I was working at city planning on Greenpoint, Williamsburg, I lived in Greenpoint, and after the rezoning passed, my landlord raised the rent $2,000 and I had to move, like from the rezoning. So like, people say, oh, it's abstract. No, it's real. We rezoned it. My landlord was like, cha-ching, and, pay or get out. So, when you have a shift or a dynamic where private interests are there, it's very difficult, honestly. And so Hunters Point South is, like I said, it's a unique situation because that land ownership is there that puts some parameters on it that prevent that, right? In 20 years, if Amazon had moved here, which was a big thing, right? If Amazon had moved here, the people who live in Hunters Point South by law attached to the land was going to be affordable housing, period. 5 years from now, 50 years from now, until the buildings are destroyed. So land ownership is the key. And so a lot of the work that is happening now in different spaces around alternative models for cooperative ownership, community land trusts, benefit corp, real estate investment trusts. So different models that the conversation is tied to the specific ownership, and connected to ownership is governance, right? So ownership and governance for how property changes and is administered and all of that and maintained over time is really the key. It's not just simply zoning, and it is definitely not transactional. So what happens and what people fall for is they do these transactional things, which is, we're going to get X more affordable housing. It's tied to your tax thing, but the tax thing expires in 10, 15, 20, 30 years, right? So that doesn't work, and people need to stop doing that.
Right. Justin, as we end our time here, do you mind just giving, if you have, I know you do, final words for students who are getting ready to get out there into practice? You talked about MARC, MSUD combo. What advice would you give students who are getting ready to practice in a world that has realities of dealing with public space, the people's interest, looking out for why are we doing what we do? Why do we design buildings? Why do we design urban spaces? What final words would you have for both students getting ready to get into the profession, but also practitioners who are on this broadcast?
Sure. And first, thank you, Joel, and everybody. This has been, great to share some of my work with Georgia Tech community, and definitely to TSW for kind of creating this space to talk about urban design and to elevate it. So my response to that is it's not a dig against Georgia Tech or your school. It's a dig against all of our schools and our profession. Is that a lot of us, frankly, have been miseducated, and it's for a lot of different reasons. What practices and best practices are, what our kind of legacies and frames of reference are, that are valuable and important, and they're out there in the world, and they need to be understood, and they need to be core to our knowledge. But there's just a lot that we don't learn in our formal educational spaces, and certainly in our professional spaces and professional and continuing education learning environments. So I would encourage both students that are coming out into the field, but also people that are in practice to really continue to find ways to keep and continue learning. And, in my own career, I sort of had to do that because I came from, architecture and urban design kind of educational base, but my first work was in a planning agency. So I had to learn a lot, right? In school, even in urban design school, we did some community engagement type work, but that was very different from, being in a planning agency and almost every night being in community meetings, right? As the core of what you're doing. And so, that curiosity and continued learning is so essential to becoming a better designer, to being a better citizen or not citizen necessarily, a civic person, someone that's contributing to society through your activities and efforts. And so definitely find ways and spaces to do that wherever they are, and to give and invest some time to that. It's hard to, because we're all very busy and frankly not necessarily the best compensated profession, and so work and life balance is hard, but work life and learning balance is key. And so maybe with this COVID situation, with all these online things, it can be a little easier for folks to do that, but look for and find spaces, especially from voices that haven't been primary in our field, more people of color, more women, more people from other contexts outside of your own, so that we can have greater kind of understanding and kind of collective frames of reference as we think about how we change our built environment.
Well, Justin, thank you so much for the wonderful evening. I just want to, apologize if your question has not been answered. The questions were just coming in really amazing, and that is a clear sign that this was great. We just want to say thank you to TSW once again for this opportunity that we've had to have this conversation, and for Georgia Tech as a School of Architecture. So thank you all. Justin, again, thank you so much for the just diverse work from New York to a different state to Africa, and we are very glad that you had the time and the energy to have a conversation with us this evening. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Joel, and we'll definitely be in touch. Everyone, Absolutely. Have a good evening.